This is Module 3, Part 2 in our unit on Buddhism, and my intent here is just to sort of briefly review the highlights of the life of Siddhartha Gautama and talk a little bit about the Four Noble Truths. It is said that the Buddha's mother, Maya, M-A-Y-A, Queen Maya, since the Buddha was born into a royal family, it is said that she had a dream and a white elephant entered her side during the dream, and after that happened she found herself, quote-unquote, with child. So what we have here is a classic virgin birth, one of many that you find in the world's religions. The virgin birth in Christianity of Christ is actually one of the more recent of the virgin birth stories, as many of the virgin birth claims are made in religions that are far older than Christianity. Anyway, so the Buddha was born as a result of a virgin birth. Of course, he's Siddhartha at this point. He's not yet the Buddha. He was born just inside the border of Nepal, north of India. So he was born actually just inside Nepal, although he would later go on to live most of his life in the Indian state of Bihar, which we've come across before. It's said that when he was born, he was walking and talking. Of course, we're talking about religious scriptures here, but it is said that he was walking and talking, so he was a child that had extraordinary abilities even at birth. Because remember, this is someone who's destined to become enlightened during his lifetime. So we're talking about a very special person here, at least according to Theravada Buddhist, a superhuman individual, and according to Mahayana Buddhists, a divine-like figure, a god-like figure. So anyway, so when Siddhartha was born, he was examined by some holy men, and it was determined that there were two destinies that could unfold in regard to the life of Siddhartha. One was that Siddhartha would become a great ruler over a great kingdom. In other words, he would continue in the footsteps of his father and continue to build the kingdom his father had built and that his father ruled over. King Suddhodana, the Buddha's father, or he would become a great holy man. And the Buddha's father was bound and determined that it would be the former destiny that would prevail for his son. Namely that he wanted his son obviously to take over his kingdom and to continue in his footsteps. And so what Suddhodana did, the Buddha's father, was basically not really keep him under house arrest, but he kept him isolated from the greater world. He wanted to keep him away from suffering and all the problems and travails of the real world, to keep him from being tempted to follow the route of a holy man. So Siddhartha was raised in really luxurious surroundings, given everything he could want. He was pampered, spoiled, and eventually he would fall in love and get married at age 29. And in fact, he would even conceive a child, Rahula, R-A-H-U-L-A, which interestingly enough means fetter, F-E-T-T-E-R, something like a chain. So it's sort of thought that the name given to the child represented the basic idea that one can actually be chained to worldly concerns and that might hold you back as you try to elevate yourself spiritually. Well, at age 29, Siddhartha actually broke away from his sort of isolated, closed environment and managed to make it out into the city, the surrounding city, and there he had his famous four sights. What did he see? Well, he saw things that he was not aware of, that he'd never seen before. First of all, he saw a very old man, and he asked his charioteer who was with him what that was. What is wrong with that person? And his charioteer basically answered, well, that person is old. And Siddhartha asked his charioteer, will that happen to all of us? And his charioteer answered, yes, that is a fate that awaits us all, my lord. And then next, they saw a very sick man. an old and sick and dying man. And the conversation went the same way. The Siddhartha asked his charioteer if that was, what was wrong with him, and charioteer answered, he's very sick, he's dying. Siddhartha responded, well, is that going to happen to all of us? And his charioteer answered, yes, my lord, that fate awaits us all. So anyway, after each sight, the conversation goes the same way. The third sight was a dead man being cremated. Of course, Siddhartha had been shielded from death and suffering and old age, so he actually didn't know about these things. And then finally he saw a holy man, a wandering ascetic, and he was told that this ascetic was trying to find the solution to end human suffering. So this gave Siddhartha a lot to think about. In fact, at that point he was so empathetic he could hardly think straight. He felt the suffering of the world so greatly that he just knew he had to do something about it. So he looked in on his wife and his child for the last time and then left. He fled his village, fled his family, shaved off his head, gave away all of his clothes, and took on beggar's clothes, so to speak. And let me say something at this point. Some might want to criticize Siddhartha for leaving his family, and certainly that is, generally speaking, a terrible thing to do, to abandon a wife and a young child. Anyone understands that. And even on some level, obviously Siddhartha did. But remember that Siddhartha will eventually find the solution to end suffering for all people. So what he is doing is going to benefit all human beings. So today, all 7 billion of us. So really, in the context of that understanding, leaving his family, while tragic and sad, pales in comparison to what he would eventually accomplish, which was to show us all the way to end suffering. Anyway, so Siddhartha sets out to learn all the religious lore and teachings of his day, and he studies under a number of different gurus and manages to master their teachings one after another. In fact, people were just amazed at how brilliant he was. But still, even after mastering all these teachings of the great masters, the great gurus, Siddhartha was still empty inside. And so then he decided to follow the path of asceticism, in fact, extreme asceticism. He would fast, he would go without, he would renounce the sort of materialistic things that we're used to, and actually he sort of joined up with 5 other ascetics who were doing the same thing. Well, to make a long story short, eventually he got to the point where he was skin and bones, and there's some very, very iconic famous statues of Siddhartha in that state, just skin and bones, and he practically died. It is said that he collapses in a stream, and a local village girl, Sujata, comes by with some rice pudding and gives it to him and sort of nurses him back to health. And Siddhartha realizes that neither the path of extreme deprivation nor extreme indulgence is the right way. Of course, he'd lived an extremely indulgent path the first 29 years of his life. The last 6 years of his life, he lived a path of extreme self-deprivation. And so that's when he hit upon the middle way, or the middle path of the Buddha. So he nursed himself back to health, abandoned the 5 people he was with, and he sat under today what's called the Bodhi tree, B-O-D-H-I, which means enlightenment in Sanskrit, the Bodhi tree. And he vowed that he would not leave until he attained enlightenment. Probably, I guess, maybe the highlight of the ordeal that he went through was that he was tempted by Mara. And Mara, in children's books, is represented as sort of like a demonic monster, but a more mature understanding of Mara tells us that Mara is something like the human ego, that thing that we have to fight against. Muslims call it the greater jihad, the jihad of the soul. Just you're fighting against your worser sort of intentions to be good, to be God-fearing, to be honorable. And that's sort of what Mara represented, was the ego, Siddhartha's ego that he had to overcome. So anyway, so Siddhartha managed to overcome, and Siddhartha actually was able to deny all of the pleasures of the world that was set in front of him. Often when I read this story, I think of Jesus in the desert after he was baptized by John the Baptist. His 40 days in the desert, both men went through something very similar. And both sort of came out on the other end stronger for the experience and began their ministries. Anyway, so there's a critical point in the story here, and that is when Mara actually raises up an army around the Buddha and basically challenged the Buddha for the spot of land the Buddha is sitting on, and shouts at the Buddha, "Who's going to speak for you? Because look at me, I have this great army behind me." And then Siddhartha touches the earth and says, "The earth will testify on my behalf," and the earth does testify on his behalf. And Mara disappears at that point, and the Buddha, well, Siddhartha becomes the Buddha at this point, which means enlightened, the enlightened one, the awakened one. So Siddhartha became the Buddha when he saw the true nature of things. At that point, he would be in that spot for, again, quite a while, and he debated with himself whether or not he could actually teach what he knew now to other individuals. But eventually, his empathy and his compassion for all drove him to begin his ministry. So he made his way to Sarnath. And you're going to see some photos I have of Sarnath when I visited there. It was a deer park. It's still a deer park today. And there he taught the Four Noble Truths to those 5 other monks or holy men that he had spent so much time with, and really got the wheel rolling, as they say, the Dharma wheel rolling. Dharma means something like truth or teaching or religious law. So the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth taught by the Buddha is that all is suffering. We cannot avoid suffering in our daily lives. We may be happy now, we may be joyful now, but we all know that that's an illusion, since sadness will return at some point. So happiness is temporary, it's not grounded in anything permanent, and it is fleeting. So as the Buddhists say, there is suffering even in happiness. Noble truth number 2, the cause of suffering, dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, suffering, is tanha, T-A-N-H-A, desire. The cause of suffering is desire. So if we can vanquish desire, we'll vanquish suffering. It seems like a pretty simple teaching, but in a way it's very, very profound. Okay, and noble truth number 3, the third noble truth, is that there is a way to end suffering. In other words, there is a way to vanquish desire and end suffering. And then finally, noble truth number 4, the way to do that is to follow the Eightfold Path of the Buddha. The Eightfold Path includes things such as right view, right aspiration, right action, right speech, right effort, right mindfulness, things of that nature. And if we do these things, we will attain enlightenment or nirvana. So the Buddha is enlightened at age 35, and he would continue his quote-unquote ministry until 483 BCE, the year he would die at 80 years old. And during that time, he established orders for monks and nuns and lay males and lay females as well. It is said that when he was nearing the end of his life, he was poisoned by possibly some mushrooms, possibly some bad pork. But it wasn't an intentional poisoning. It was like an accidental food poisoning. And the Buddha knew this and anticipated his death and gathered his followers around him, which really would number in the tens of thousands by that time, and told them that they are not to worship him, the man, They're not to build statues to him, etc. And his final words were something along the lines that all things are impermanent and strive for your salvation. So at that point he dies, and they call that the Buddha's pari-nirvana, P-A-R-I-N-I-R-V-A-N-A. In other words, his final nirvana. Up to that point, remember, he was enlightened, but he was on earth, living and breathing and eating and interacting and so forth. So it was sort of enlightenment with residues, so to speak. But at this point, he would attain full enlightenment, and that's why they refer to it as parinirvana, his final enlightenment.